We'll begin this presentation where we left off with the last one, and that is really looking at how wildlife as a profession got its start in the 1930s. And although Aldo Leopold was the first to put a name to it, he was the first to create curriculum and a course and encourage there to be research that drove management decisions. It's important to note that many states had people in place that whose responsibility it was to protect or regulate natural resources. So this isn't like our very first conservation officers happened in the 1930s, but it was the 1930s that the realization that we better put some more thought into it rather than just creating laws and having nothing really to base those decisions upon. I'd like you to watch this video, Beginning of a Profession, and I will link it separately in your assignment tool so that you can watch it. But it gives a nice overview of how the early stages of wildlife management kind of came about. All right, I've mentioned a few key pieces of legislation already. Hopefully you remember the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Lacey Act, both very important pieces for stopping market hunting. Some other important pieces of legislation in the last couple of centuries is the 1934 Duck Stamp Act. So remember, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was 1916. This came along, 15 years later or so, which said, not in addition to having to buy your hunting license, if you're going to hunt migratory birds, you have to purchase this additional stamp. And this is still in effect today. That money goes back to the federal government to manage migratory birds, rather than money going back to the state, which is what our license fees go to. But it's perhaps this act, the 1937 Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act, it's one of the most important acts for wildlife funding, wildlife conservation funding in North America. What this did, and still does today, is it places an excise tax on firearms and ammunitions. And then that tax goes back into a pot of money at the federal government, and then states can apply to receive that money in order to fund wildlife conservation projects. Early on, these were really focused at waterfowl improvement projects, waterfowl habitat improvement, but now you can use them for a wide variety of projects, and our state relies heavily on this pool of money. It's important to know that it is not a general tax, it's an excise tax, so meaning it's taxed at the manufacturing level anytime you buy a firearm or ammunition. I believe that also archery, fishing rods, those all get taxed as well. I will say the fishing rods is a similar act called the Federal Aid and Sport Fish Restoration Act, otherwise known as the Dingell-Johnson Act or Wallop-Breaux Act. They're very similar in function to the PR Act or the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act, but instead it's money for fisheries management instead of wildlife management. And both of them, they can be used for education, restoration projects, you name it. It'd be a fun project to get online and see how much Colorado received in the last year and where that money went. Multiple Use Act came about in 1960. This was right alongside with some forest management pieces of legislation, but it required national forest policy to include forms of land uses besides timber management and besides grazing management. So this said we need to plan for recreation. We need to plan for some non-consumptive uses of our national forest lands rather than just simply timber and grazing. In 1962, a landmark book was written by Rachel Carson. Hopefully you've heard of it, called Silent Spring. And what she wrote about was, what would it be like if we woke up tomorrow and no birds were singing because they had all died due to the impacts that we were doing to our environment. Namely, she noticed that DDT, a common pesticide, a very effective pesticide that was being used in the United States during this time, was killing off birds by the thousands, including our state or our national symbol, the bald eagle. And this book brought awareness to these concerns to the general public and actually started an entire environmental movement. So Rachel Carson's and I think Rachel Carson was a marine biologist who decided to write a book, and she really changed the course of history in North America as far as we are concerned with environmentalism. The Wilderness Act, 1964, this set aside areas of national forest for wilderness purposes, meaning that you couldn't use them for any kind of consumptive use like timber or range or mineral consumption, and instead they were managed much more like national parks were managed. So that's another lesson, but national parks and national forests have very different management philosophies. And the Endangered Species Act in 1966 went through many revisions. I think 1973 is the current revision that we use. And the Endangered Species Act, of course, allowed us to put in special protections for species that were threatened or endangered of becoming extinct. And I'll also link this short video so that you don't watch it as part of my video, but you might want to watch that separately. And then National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, in 1969. This established the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. It made any government agency have to write an environmental impact statement for any federally assisted projects likely to have an environmental effect. So for example, if a national forest wanted to build a visitor center, they would have to conduct this EIS, this environmental impact statement, in order to prove that their actions won't have a negative effect on the environment that they can't mitigate somehow. Now, as you go in your education, I'd highly encourage you to take a class, an entire class, yes, on these environmental impact statements, because if you work for the federal government, they'll be a large part of your career. The NEPA Act also established the Council on Environmental Quality. So the 1960s was really the era of environmentalism, and you'll hear that in some of your other classes. This was a big time in our area, in our history, of creating laws that really focused on protection of resources. 1972 Clean Water Act, 1973 Clean Air Act. 1973, yeah, there's the Endangered Species Act that we actually follow today. 1972 was the Marine Mammals Protection Act, which this is really important to protect things like whales and sea lions from over-harvesting, sea otters. So any marine mammal falls under the protection of this act, and whether or not they're endangered or threatened. And in 1977, the Clean Water Act really became more effective. In 1975, we get CITES. You'll hear this when we're talking about international protections. This was the first time that nations came together and decided that we needed to not only preserve animals within our boundaries, but we needed to look outside of our walls and protect animals that were threatened in other places. So this is a group of countries that come together and decide on a worldwide list of protective species. You'll see this as the IUCN Red List, and those animals then are protected for trade and use under CITES. So it's kind of similar to our Endangered Species Act. It's not quite as regulatory, but it does put some kinds of protections on things like black rhinos and leopards and cheetahs and things that might need protection in other countries, pandas. Okay, so here's kind of our themes for the past few decades, just to kind of speed through the second half of the 20th century, or the last third rather. The 1960s and 70s, that was your environmental era, right? The 1980s, we have focused on domestic energy, trying to get energy production more within the United States. We had range wars, and we still have range wars today, but range wars are simply where maybe for generations people have been grazing on federal land and they don't want to be told that they can't, or they don't want to be told that they have different regulations than they used to have, or they feel that it shouldn't be public land. So there's been some pretty big standoffs concerning grazing since the 1980s. We had farm closures starting to happen in the 80s. 1990s, technology really starts becoming part of everyday life. We start realizing that we can manage wildlife a lot better if we understand who's related to whom. And when we were able to sequence the genetic code, that became much more practical wildlife management tool. And from the 90s to today, it is a fast growing field. Wildlife genetics, we will learn more about that as the semester goes on, but keep that in the back of your mind because that is a field that's just going to be becoming more and more and more important. We start thinking more globally in the 1990s about resource protection. In the 2000s, really starting to get more into consumption. Our human population continues to grow, and so we have challenges with that. And we really start hearing about climate change in the general public. This is not new information in the 2000s to our scientists, but it really is when it started to get the limelight. So Al Gore can probably take some credit for letting the common American citizen understand what climate change is. And I'd say that's probably when people started asking each other if you believed in climate change. Okay, 2010, in this current decade, one of our biggest issues now is urbanization. We're continuing to grow and spread out from our urban centers, the Front Range being a prime example. And we have a big push for management agencies to start working together. We start getting more outsourcing and contracting through our federal agencies instead of doing everything in-house. And we start focusing more on wildlife management on private lands instead of public lands. This is absolutely critical moving forward, that we get private landowners on board with some of the practices going on in public lands. Okay, so we'll fly through this, hard to do online, but think about these things and what do you value? Animals should have rights similar to humans. Yes or no, right? Predator control is unacceptable. The careful use of poison is an acceptable method to control wildlife. Should we be putting poisons out on the landscape? It is unacceptable to remove native predators that prey on a threatened or endangered species. So do they have the right to be there, and what does that mean for the endangered species? Is species extinction inevitable? Wildlife management should be funded by general public via a tax. We would probably have a lot more money for wildlife management if we did that. Private ownership of land should extend to wildlife on that land as well. If you own the land, you own the wildlife. And who do you identify as? These are questions I ask you because it is important to start thinking about what you believe so that you can listen better to what other people believe. And we'll talk a lot about this, that the best way to be an effective manager is to not have closed ears, right? To think about and listen to what other people's viewpoints are so that you can understand where they're coming from. If you cannot understand where they're coming from, you will not be effective at changing anything in their mindset either. And I'm going to go ahead and stop here. We'll start our third segment with the 7 pillars of North American wildlife conservation.